Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Dalgoro Hach and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by my friends
Giselle Donnelly. I also work at AEI and
Yulia Joja with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown, and George Washington Universities.
On our podcast, we talk about the challenges to European peace and security that have erupted along a line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the Eastern Front, and about why those matter to the United States. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thank you. Today, it is just the three of us. We will be talking about the upcoming NATO summit in Washington next week. We'll be talking about the little paper that we've just put out on NATO at 75 and the prospects for the future relevance of the alliance. And I want to just jump right in with Giselle. We watched the presidential debate last week, at least it's a safe assumption that we sort of heard some of the news and some of the quotes from.
Unfortunately, we did, yes.
it was like watching a car crash.
So in one of the moments, the former President Trump said that before he came to power, NATO had almost gone out of business. And he framed the problem in terms of burden sharing, that it was just the United States that was spending, 100%, close to 100% of the entire, I guess, alliance's defense budget, which, I mean, let's sort of set the facts aside. But I wonder what you think of this framing of the relevance of NATO to US interests, that if, we spend more than others, then it's a bad deal. If others spend more, it's a good deal. What was missing from this understanding of America's alliances and NATO in particular?
It sounds like we should invite him to the summit.
Getting Trump to sit still for that long would be a challenge. Getting me to sit still for those interminable summit plenaries would probably be difficult too. But to answer Dalibor's question, I think former President Trump is just looking through the wrong end of the telescope. The main product that the alliance produces is European security and the protection of American interests in a favorable balance of power in Europe, which is, since before the United States was a country, our principal concern in global politics. And it remains so. Not to get too wonky about this, but the structure of the American-led international order, which we all are benefiting from, begins with European security. The United States has always had a Europe-first strategy, and for a good reason, because that's where most of the world's troubles have emanated from for centuries. And the fact that it has been under NATO and through American power, that there hasn't been a major war until 2022 on the European continent is due to the exercise of American power through the North Atlantic Alliance. I mean, that is about as obvious as a hand grenade in a bowl of oatmeal, to quote the famous geopolitician Foghorn Leghorn. So I think Trump is using this not because he's engaged in the issue or has really a different understanding. There are a lot of pundits and international relations theorists who try to spin Trump as the most realist president we've had in ever. I think it's just Trump expressing a gut feeling, sort of, xenophobia, a willingness to try to, make domestic political hay by smearing Europeans. It also, I'll just conclude with this, Europe provides the battlefield, whether it was the Cold War and West Germany, or now the Eastern Front, which is our raison d'etre. What we see today in Ukraine is probably a miniature of what would have ensued during a major war during the period of the Cold War. So we now are reminded about what happens when things go wrong in Europe, how bad that is for American security interests, how terrible it is for humanity, how upsetting it is to the European balance, and how the United States needs to play a leading role in order to try to achieve a good outcome.
Before we move away from the debate, Giselle, I want to turn this one more time back to you and ask you, okay, so fair enough about Trump, but as I was watching the debate and the Ukraine topic came up, it occurred to me one more time while Biden was answering and Trump was making his demagogic arguments and, some you can grab onto to almost when you listen to him in comparison with Biden. But then Biden, one more time, has failed to explain to the American people why Ukraine and why Europe matter. And it seems to me that 2.5 years into this war, of course, we wouldn't be better off with Trump. That seems to be, no matter what he says, that there wouldn't have been a war with he would have been president, etc. But I'm not sure we are in a good place now with the administration that is not Trump's, that seems to be opposed to Trump's.
I agree entirely, and I think I can speak for you, the two of you, in saying that was part of the reason that we undertook writing this report, was not simply to prevent the worst from happening, but to point out to people that we are not achieving the absolute best outcome, and that we are leaving strategic opportunities, geopolitical opportunities on the table, and finally to remind people of why NATO enlargement was undertaken in the first place. There was a coherent goal, to use George H.W. Bush's famous phrase, a Europe whole and free. And we have not achieved that. We had the opportunity of a millennia to do so after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And we have left a lot of Eastern Europe in kind of a no man's land position. So I think part of what we were trying to do was to not only, not just celebrate 75 years of NATO's success and prevent its achievements from being undone, but to find a purpose or to articulate what has been the traditional purpose of the alliance and to remind people that the task remains before us. That's the subtitle of the report, that this is something that we should do and can do for a very modest price. So, we need to not only look backwards, not only deal with reality as it is, but set forth a redefinition of what the purpose of the alliance is that takes it into the future beyond the 75th.
I suppose part of the problem seems to be that there are people who would say, yes, Europe traditionally was the preoccupation number one for US foreign policy, but now the world has changed, particularly with the rise of China and importance of Asian economies, and that Europe itself has become pacified, in particular the part of Europe that has become part of NATO and the European Union, and also it's one of the world's largest economies. There is no reason why Europeans should not be able to take care of their own security and deter Russia. I mean, whatever Russian depredations in places like Georgia and Ukraine might be, Russia, according to this view of the world, does not pose a direct kinetic threat to Germany, France, etc. And we have simply more pressing issues to attend to in Asia. And I think that view of the world just ignores something that I think should have become apparent in recent months, namely that the sources of instability are very tightly connected. That what happens in the Red Sea with Houthi pirates, and what happens in Ukraine, and what happens in Georgia, and what happens in South China Sea, I mean, all these things are connected. We see sort of Beijing bankrolling some of these regimes. We see Putin going to North Korea, enhance military cooperation, and so on and so forth. I was just in Tbilisi, and I think Yulia was in Georgia as well. One thing that struck me was all this discussion about the so-called middle corridor in Georgia and plans by China to basically build a new trade route to reach Europe. The Georgian government, which is a Russian-aligned government, gave or sold the port of Anaklia, which is a deep sea port in the Black Sea, to a Chinese consortium. And so again, the idea that these are just separate things and we can just ignore the no man's land in Eastern Europe and focus on China, that we will be successful in our focus on China by ignoring the rest, just strikes me as a just very naive view of the world, particularly at a time when really, the world is globalized. People communicate. It's very easy to have trade links, financial links, send money from one end of the planet to another, where, we cooperate, and the good actors, if I may say so myself, do cooperate, but so do the bad guys.
The view that you just sort of sketched out is sort of like the kiddie soccer version of international politics, where the blob of kids follows the ball wherever it goes and squabble over it for a bit, and then the ball pops out in some other place, and the mob of kids goes and chases the ball again. Finally, I would just say, it's a very naive understanding of what a global power does. It's sort of like being the system administrator that requires keeping every part of the system up and running are functioning, at least marginally so. And, I think we can go farther and say that Russia would be in a world of hurt without the support that it's getting from China and North Korea and Iran. So if you didn't think they were connected before, the Ukraine war is sort of exhibit A in the refutation of that argument. Yulia, you were going to say.
Yeah, it seems to me this is basically to build off what both of you are saying and to tie it back to our report. To my understanding, the challenge right now for NATO as an alliance where the United States is leader, but everybody has a veto right, is to think collectively in terms of, first of all, identifying strategy, right? Identifying these threats as being interconnected, and then having the political will to commit collectively, including the countries that, how do I say this, are not born to think strategically, smaller countries that just cannot afford to look a few.
Smaller countries like Germany.
Well, it depends on the history and the strategic culture, but I do see this having just traveled to small and then medium to want to be large size countries in the region. How, if your territory is limited, you have an incapacity just based on resources to think further than a few hundred kilometers away from your borders. And so I think that is part of the challenge. That, of course, is not an excuse for powers such as number one, United States, where administrations over the past few years have been oftentimes thinking parochially rather than strategically. And I think that's what we're trying to work towards in this report too, to make the argument that we cannot see the threat that comes from Russia to the alliance separate from the threat that comes from Iran to the alliance. And we have the moving parts or bits of these resources already in place to connect them to strategic thinking, such as, for instance, ballistic missile defense. Small parenthesis, there's a reason why Russia has been obsessed with ballistic missile defense of NATO that is supposed to be against Iran. Russia has been obsessed for years. And we, of course, cannot separate China neither. Dalibor was building on what he's learning in Georgia, and I think many of us are. I went to the region and asked about China in Turkey and in Romania. And again, they're not that aware, but China is in there. And the last element here that to me has been very strong, and I wish we would build on it more in the framework of the summit. We have the tools, we just don't know how to articulate it. Is I remember a few months ago, before the supplemental was finally approved for Ukraine, the Prime Minister of Japan came and spoke to Congress. And basically what he said was to beg Congress to approve the supplemental aid for Ukraine. Now, of course, Japan doesn't think about Ukraine as a main ally, but it's very obvious to them that if Russia isn't stopped there, Russia together with China is going to come already their signs for Japan. And so I wish we would, and I think we're trying to do that with this report, but at the summit too, I wish we would better connect the instruments that we have at hand and build more onto the strategic understanding that we can benefit from countries like Japan and Ukraine in this instance, frontline, medium-sized, that understand better the threat at hand.
Dalibor, you've also been traveling a lot. I mean, I think part of what we tried to do in the report, and obviously a lot of what we try to do on this podcast, is bring that frontline state perspective back to Washington. I'd like to ask the two of you actually to elaborate on this, like what's going on out there.
Maybe to go back to the report for a second, I don't think we have to sort of give a full summary of what we do in the report. We'll include it in show notes, but I want to say that in the introduction that you, Giselle, you wrote, you start with Lord Ismay, who was the Secretary General of the Alliance, and his famous dictum about keeping the Russians out, Americans in, and the Germans down. And I think that's a useful way of organizing one's thinking about the alliance 75 years ago and today. So arguably, the need to keep the Russians out is still very pressing. It might not be an insurmountable task to keep the Russians out. And we see that Article 5 guarantees work. It's not a coincidence that Russians are waging wars against countries that are not in NATO, and for all the gray zone warfare against Estonia, Lithuania, etc. Russia, the Russians are careful about that. It might not even require sort of massive increases in American presence and treasure and servicemen to keep it that way. I mean, there might be sort of adjustments at the margin that we contemplate in the report that might make that deterrent force more effective, such as, bringing in nuclear weapons into the mix and making sure that these frontline states are able to take part in the sort of collective nuclear deterrent of the alliance. I mean, the big important question is, how do you keep Americans in? How do you keep them sort of engaged and interested and committed to that alliance? And that was always somewhat of a challenge, which is kind of connected to this question of, keeping Germany down. So obviously I understand the sort of German question was central to the immediate post-war reconstruction of Europe. How do we keep Germany from, becoming this monster again that it had twice become in its bid to conquer the European landmass? But arguably on that front, that's where NATO has achieved its sort of unambiguous and clear success. I mean, Germany is down, right? And it's sort of hence the Trumpian complaint about, free riding and Germans not paying their fair share. But I think that's where it's important to bring in the frontline state perspective, because like from where I'm sitting, like I don't even care if Germany is in NATO anymore. Maybe I shouldn't be saying this out loud, but there are moments when I think, okay, like, Germany is not being threatened by Russia. Like if Germany wants to be a Switzerland, it can be a Switzerland. It will be big. It would sort of create, all kinds of like logistic issues. But ultimately, NATO like isn't there primarily for the defense of Germany. Like if Germany is free riding, we can say we are not coming to your rescue, Germany, but it's not like anybody, like it's not like Denmark is going to start, another war over Schleswig or whatever.
It's 1664 again. You can never be sure what's going to happen.
There is a case to be made for like sort of forgetting about these traditional Western European countries and really focusing on the eastern flank, where you have countries that are 100% committed to their security, that are spending tons and tons of money on their defense, that are buying all the American kit that exists, that are even in some cases fully on board with very hawkish positions on China. And there, I think that sort of argument about free riding is becoming much, much weaker. And I think the sort of alliance skeptics have to be reminded of the fact that, like, it's, again, it's not a sort of welfare system set up to bankroll European defenses. It's not a way of, giving charity to like lazy Europeans. It's a way of stabilizing that eastern flank in a way that's conducive to our interests. So that, for example, that the Chinese don't build, sort of trade routes and infrastructure and stuff as they please, connecting China to European markets. I mean, it's sort of like we give something to the Europeans, and it also gives us leverage over how they behave and how they structure their thinking about the world. And that is consistently being forgotten, I think, both by sort of the Trumpian transactionalist wing and also by, dare I say, the Blinken establishment that is sort of clinging to what strikes me as somewhat sort of outdated and narrow view of the alliance, that's sort of caught in cliches and shared value references and so on and so forth. And I think we have to sort of move beyond that and make the case for how NATO is primarily a tool for the United States to sort of confront this concatenation of nasty regimes that wish us ill around the world.
The one problem that I have here to fold in NATO summit with what is now becoming a very plausible chance that Trump is going to be reelected is the issue of the new NATO Secretary General. To sum it up, in my understanding, we all enthusiastically, or less so, chose Mark Rutte because he is from a country in which he as prime minister has never made an effort to reach 2%. And if Trump comes back, is most likely to make the argument on behalf of these Western Europeans that have still no intention to reach 2%, whether we're talking about Belgium or we're talking about Spain. And the very reason why Trump is, for the wrong reasons, but it doesn't matter, Trump is adamant or is making the threat, the argument that he won't help with Russia if countries don't pay up. So the East pays up and the East is being threatened by Russia. Russia has no way of getting to Belgium. They're not going to threaten it. but NATO is falling apart and the United States is not helping frontline states because Belgium is not paying up. And so these cliches in which we're still very much moving for probably wrong feeling of comfort, oh, this feels like old Europe, this feels like old NATO, we're back to our roots, it feels like it's going to come back and bite us because of the very high chance in a few months that we're dealing with exactly this problem. That Mark Rutte will not be able, because he does not have the tools and, may I say, the values to strongly defend aid for Ukraine and support for frontline states.
Let us hope for the best from Mark Rutte. I didn't expect a whole lot from Ursula von der Leyen either, but she's done much better.
Oh, yes. About her, I'm very happy. In her, I trust my European future.
Okay, so let's hope that some of the Ursula pixie dust rubs off. So I think this is a both and proposition. The way to incentivize Germany and old Europe to do the right thing is to do the right thing ourselves. And Dollar was quite right. I think potentially Ukraine could be another Poland in the sense of being sort of an absolute bulwark of the Western Front, the Eastern Front of the Western project. So yeah, these are people who understand that their freedom is, something they have to work for, that was not handed to them. And I think that to the degree that we can create an example of sort of, strategic engagement, wisdom, the fact that the Germans don't have a functional global strategic culture is a huge problem. But I think to disengage.
But it's also something we always wanted, right?
Well,
At least like 1946, if somebody told you Germans will relinquish like any ambitions to shape world events.
Their pacifism is the problem rather than their aggressiveness. That's an extraordinary accomplishment, but they're still not a mature geopolitical nation, right? And it has a limiting effect on us. I mean, the Ukraine war has been sort of conducted at the pace of Olaf Scholz, and keeping German anxieties have been a huge deterrent to alliance action and American action overall. But, that doesn't have to be forever either.
That was our choice, right? Like we didn't have to keep the pace set by Olaf Scholz. Like we could have easily left him behind with his anxieties and pacifism and concerns about escalation. That was a choice made by the administration, and there was this tradition, which is why I'm sort of like talking about the somewhat outdated view of the alliance in the sort of Biden segment of Washington, that they're still clinging on to this view of Western Europe as being in the driver's seat on the European side of the alliance, whereas these countries are, I want to be careful with my language, but I don't think they're central to the alliance. You could sort of imagine NATO again, without Germany in it. It would raise issues, but it's no longer about defending West Germany against the Soviets. If they want to be part of it, that's in principle fine, and we shouldn't be punishing Poland and the Baltic states because the Netherlands or Belgium are not meeting the 2% target. It's almost irrelevant to the broader strategic question facing Americans and Eastern Europeans. And again, the fact that we sort of deferred to Western Europeans on some of these things is a mark of a slightly obsolete view of NATO in the 21st century.
If I may try to sort of sum it up and add maybe to it, and you tell me either of you if you disagree, to me the framework is still, and I think that also guided our report too, that the focus on front lines. And while Germany was a front line for many years, we listened to Germany, whether they wanted more of an Ostpolitik or they wanted, their view on the front line as being part of the front line was essential. And I think we're making the argument that Ukrainians and Poles and Romanians do not think in the same way as Germany did, but now they are the front lines. And how do we think about front lines so that our costs diminish? And that's, to me, what it comes down to. And here I'll promise I'll do more quotes from more interesting interviews when we talk about our trips. But this is one of my favorites, and it was a big takeaway. My favorite former chief of staff of the Romanian Armed Forces, who told me me one thing to frame, and I'll connect the two. At some point, he said, you know what? I'm more pro-American than Americans. That says something about front lines and something that we should appreciate more. But he also told me in a very sort of hard, realist way, he said, and it reminded me of Polish strategic thinking. There are parallels there. He said, you know, I have to be pragmatic. We have two choices from a Romanian point of view as members of NATO. We can either prepare for a Ukraine that is a member of NATO, and then the front line changes based on what Giselle was saying earlier, and we have a more stable front line, or we can prepare, and that's the other alternative. We, Romania, and we, Poland, have to prepare for a Ukraine that is pro-Russian, a Russian proxy, all the way possible to Belarus. This is the other alternative. So what are we fighting for, and what is our vision then for NATO going forward? To me, that makes a lot of sense. And so this is another way of bringing it back to the same frame. These are the frontline people we have now. Let's work with them to make sure that we're getting the best deal out of it. It's not Germany in the Cold War anymore.
Look, I think that is the central task that we set for ourselves, was to try to lay out both a definition of what success would be in Europe, what a Europe whole and free would actually look like, and then some suggestions in general of how to try to achieve that. Bringing these frontline states into the alliance as soon as possible, even if it means a Ukraine that's not fully restored its sovereignty, just the way West Germany was central to NATO in the Cold War. You know, one of the goals of the Cold War strategy was to try to reunite heartland Germany and to liberate Warsaw Pact states. So applying that basic approach to where we are now suggests, like I say, bringing in these frontline states, even if they're in political turmoil, again, a la Greece in the 1940s. But it requires the articulation and the acceptance of a strategic purpose for the alliance.
And I would say that the imperative of bringing these countries in, Ukraine and eventually Georgia and Moldova, into NATO, I think becomes all the more important, the more turbulent in a way their politics is, and the graver the Russian threat. Is that, you know, like if Ukraine, like tomorrow, wins the war and expels every last Russian home, and Ukrainians are back in Crimea, and, you know, Russian fleet is gone, etc., then maybe Russia isn't all that strong, and maybe the Ukrainians, like, you know, like don't really need NATO security guarantees that much. But if this war ends up in a sort of frozen conflict situation with some sort of ceasefire and you know, big parts of 20% of Ukraine's territory, let's say, under Russian control, I mean, then it becomes really imperative that Ukrainians' hand be strengthened so that Russians never try this again, unless we want, you know, these wars to be a regular occurrence.
Or that they don't try again like they do in Georgia, where you were also mentioning earlier, and what we've both seen, that after Russia essentially failed to take over entirely militarily Georgia, they've gone the hybrid route, or whatever you want to call it, and now we have a country that is essentially in the pocket of Russia. And so that's an entirely possible scenario for Ukraine too, in the medium to long term, depending on how we end this war and how determined we are to strengthen the alliance, including its front lines.
Well, but we also have, you know, Russian-influenced governments in Hungary and Slovakia now. So again, if you want to reverse that, success in Ukraine and asserting Western influence and American desire for a free Europe and willingness to invest in that is just essential. I mean, again, it's not that we've left opportunities unfulfilled, but some of the opportunities that were there a decade or so ago have been allowed to atrophy or go south, or, you know, have slipped backwards. And, you know, it's not just enough to assert or to define or articulate a vision, but to bring it into reality and to take the practical steps that are necessary. And you're quite right. The frontline states are America's best partners in this. But the other thing is, the idea that we can do this simply bilaterally, I think, is a huge canard. Also kind of a fallback argument offered by the sort of realist cabal in Europe and the United States that, we can do this on kind of a la carte way, I think is a huge mistake. The Poles are not going to be fully trusting or, are going to hedge if the alliance in the United States leave a Ukraine that could be a threat to them because of Russian either conquest or influence or creating a puppet government in Kyiv. So, it's sort of like one of those things where we're halfway over the fence. We can't go backwards. We can't fall down. We have to go forwards.
Yeah, I think it should be, as simple as the title of this recent book by our friend Matt Kroenig and his co-author. I mean, they lose, we win. I mean, we haven't had a discussion of the book. We can do it some other day. But in principle, I mean, that's the idea that like we should be taking strategic initiative ourselves, making sure that the bad guys are losing and that we are winning. And the way to do it is to make sure that the ever-growing number of countries join our camp, that they be resilient against Russian, Chinese, Iranian influence, and that it be Putin and Xi and the mullahs of Iran who will be left wondering about, what's the next step that the United States and our allies will do to destabilize them, rather than the status quo, which is exactly the reverse, where we are wondering, what's the next thing that Putin will do to do harm to us.
And frankly, also to bang on the fact that when else in history have we seen countries that are not just striving for our values, but that are making ultimate sacrifices, whether we're talking about Georgia or Ukraine, or to some extent Moldova increasingly, and even Armenia, to be able to join this club. And of course, the big example here, the big elephant, is Central and Eastern Europe and what these countries in the 1980s and 1990s went through, including sacrifices, including sending people when we didn't know exactly why, frankly, to Afghanistan and Iraq from some of these smaller countries, to be able to join this. Russia and China have to essentially almost force countries into their midst. And here it's the opposite. And instead of embracing that and adding a little bit of cost for what we're cashing in on and basically benefiting from in terms of enormous soft power, we're letting them in this limbo. I wish we would have at least the ego big enough to do it for our ego, if not for the right reasons.
Well, to paraphrase another old British politicians, states don't have egos, they have interests, right? Just two last things. First of all, to go back to Dallibor's point, it's important, and what's sort of crippling about the old Atlanticists of the Biden-Blinken school is that they're just at this point reactive to basically what the Russians do or others do from the outside, rather than being on the front foot. And again, that's kind of one thing we try to set out in the report is suggestions about not simply deterring the Russians by denying them further conquests in their project of rebuilding their empire, but to put at risk things that they already think that they possess. So, I mean, again, it's just getting the alliance back on the front foot and leaning forward in the way that you guys have suggested, I think is an essential task. I mean, the alliance is like a shark. If it's not moving, it's going to die.
Now, listeners can obviously find the report NATO at 75 on IEI's website. We'll be talking more about it at various events in the coming days, and we hope that the report will have some currency in the conversations leading to the NATO summit. So from me, Dalibor Rohac, and my friends Giselle Donnelly and Julia Joja, thank you for listening to the Eastern Front. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. To stay up to date with the Eastern Front, please give us a follow on Twitter at Eastern Front Pod, written as one word, and sign up for our newsletter through the link included in the show notes. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, ai.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you and goodbye.